Okay, so we're here today for ballot measure 118. I'd like to ask the proponents of the measure who put this on the ballot to begin by briefly explaining to the measure, remembering that many people watching this may not know how it works, what it would do. So just briefly, how it works, what it would do, why it's a good idea. Just a couple minutes, we'll come back and have much more time to delve into the details. So please go ahead.
Do you want to introduce yourself first, and then I can introduce and do the opening?
Of course. Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Antonio Gisbert. He, him are my pronouns, and I am the chief petitioner of the Oregon rebate, which is now Measure 118.
My name is Stacy Rutland. I'm an advisor to the Oregon rebate, and I'm happy to do a quick opening. So, first of all, I want to thank Willamette Week and everybody here for giving us an opportunity to have this conversation. We appreciate this opportunity and want to make sure that we are able to engage with the press and with the opponents in thoughtful, kind of straightforward discourse. So this is a great opportunity to do that. For far too long, Oregonians have seen an increase in rent, education, and everyday living costs, with minimum wage not effectively keeping up. If the minimum wage of the 1970s had kept up with inflation, it would now be $25 an hour. The lack of a living wage has led to, according to a 2023 report from United Ways, 44% of Oregonians here unable to cover their monthly costs, and nearly half are not able to afford to cover an unexpected $1,000 expense. This is more than 2 million Oregonians. Measure 118 is designed to address these issues in the most direct way possible, issuing about $1,600 to every individual in the state every year. That's $6,400 for a family of 4. This is done by increasing the corporate revenue tax to 3% for every dollar over $25 million in revenue. The first $25 million in revenue, the rate stays the same. But every dollar over that $25 million, corporates will have to pay 3 pennies. Measure 118 will decrease child poverty by nearly half. It will reduce senior poverty rates. It will insert billions of dollars back into the state and local economies and help more Oregonians cover those basic costs. We're excited that 170,000 Oregonians felt this measure was worth being on the ballot and signed the petition. We look forward to every Oregonian having a chance to weigh in on this matter in November.
Great, thank you. Angela.
Good morning, and again, I just want to echo the sentiments of you having us here and the ability to engage in that discourse and in settings like this where we can all talk openly and freely. So thank you to the Willamette Week for having us. I'm Angela Wilhelms. I'm the president and CEO of Oregon Business and Industry, which is a nonprofit membership-based organization that represents businesses of all sizes, from all industries, and from each of Oregon's 36 counties in state-level government, policy, etc. And we are leading the coalition opposed to Measure 118. Measure 118 at its core is a tax on sales. It is the largest tax increase in Oregon's history at nearly $7 billion in annual revenue. This is a costly tax without exception on products or services. So food, even medicine, medical services, insurance, etc., everyday necessities will be taxed. It's not, complicated. When you tax sales, the cost to consumers goes up, and it's the worst possible time for that. We've seen historic inflation in record years, and right now it costs the average Oregon household $11,000 more to buy the same things they bought just 3 years ago. A tax on sales is only going to exacerbate that problem. In addition, there's no guarantee Oregonians are going to see this money that the proponents are proffering they'll get. It's a statutory measure that the legislature can amend at any time. The number can fluctuate just based on economic circumstances, but the legislature could actually go in, amend the measure, and redirect the money for other purposes. I want to come back to one important thing too. This is a tax on sales. It's not a tax on income. It's not a tax on profit. It's a gross receipts tax that applies whether a company makes a large profit, a small profit, or even loses money. This stifles innovation. And because it can happen at every step of the supply chain in Oregon where you have an affected company, you have a couple of really important outcomes there too. You have the negative consequence of a compounding tax, which means the tax is actually more than 3% by the time it gets to the end consumer. and you make Oregon
Can
companies
you
less
just-
competitive.
Let's slow that down a little
Yeah.
bit. I think a lot of people have struggled with that concept.
Yeah.
It came up and it's come up in other measures. So what do you mean by a compounding tax?
Yeah, economists refer to it as a pyramiding tax or a compounding tax. And what happens is, let's take a 2x4 that's harvested in Oregon, milled in Oregon, sold in Oregon to, maybe one of you wants to fix your fence or build a new deck at, your house.
4x4s for the fence.
4x4 for the fence.
Yeah,
Okay, fair.
close.
Yeah, fair. Good point. Okay, so 4x4.
Just kidding.
We can pivot to that too. We make those in Oregon. So if that tree is harvested by a landowner that's affected by the tax, milled at an Oregon mill that's affected by this tax, sold to a wholesaler or distributor that's affected by the tax, to a retailer, and then to the consumer, you're talking about up to 4 times that 3% tax on sales is applied in the supply chain. So we're talking about basic products. We're talking about groceries, low margin businesses, same thing, food products. We're really proud of the food products we make in Oregon. But we're going to make Oregon companies less competitive because there's an incentive to move some of those supply chain pieces or steps out of the state of Oregon. So that's what we mean by compounding.
Good. So coming back to you guys, where is the largest example of a universal basic income program that you would point to? Because I think supporters of this have talked about their support for universal basic income. So if you could briefly explain what UBI is and then kind of point to where you'd say, hey, this is what you should look at if you want to understand how this has worked elsewhere.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about Alaska and then I'll answer it? I'll reply to Angela's comment.
Sure, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack around what Angela just said, for sure, so hopefully, but we'll start with the universal side of things. Universal basic income is in its heart an idea around the fact that the biggest barrier for folks and the biggest reason that people live in poverty is because they don't have enough money, and that the most direct and simple way to address poverty is to actually give people money. So it's called basic income because it's about elevating the overall floor for everybody to be able to have the funds that they need to be able to cover their basic needs. Alaska has a permanent fund that they passed, the state of Alaska, they passed it in the late 70s, but it was implemented in the early 80s, so more than 40 years of implementation there. It's very similar in the sense that it's a one-time payment. It is there for everybody as well. They've seen huge decreases in childhood poverty, in particular with BIPOC communities, Indigenous and Black communities, who we know ultimately pay a bigger price based on the way our systems function and have higher rates of poverty. It's also what we've seen over the last 50 years when you do some analysis of inflation rates. The inflation rates of Alaska are actually lower than the state level inflation rates. The average federal inflation rates. Some of this is due to a range of pieces, but one is that when the dividends are released, which is usually somewhere between August and October, those dividends, all of the businesses in the state know that a whole bunch of people have a whole bunch of money, and it's almost like a Black Friday experience where costs are
Is there
reduced.
another example? Because Antonio pointed this out to us before, and when you think about it, I don't want to speak for Angela, but we're in some ways talking about the competitive nature of business here. If taxes go up in Oregon businesses may leave. With the UBI payment in Alaska, that's coming from a natural resource.
And to be clear, they don't call it a UBI.
Right,
It's a very different structure.
In other words,
Semantics
that
aside.
payment is based on the geology of the state of Alaska, not based on a program. So is there I know there have been smaller, like in Stockton, California, I think,
Sure.
in a couple of European countries, but is there another non-Alaska example that you would point us to?
Sure, there's 180 pilots happening across the country right now. 40,000 people are receiving a monthly basic income.
So 40,000 in total?
In total,
So
that's right.
This would be by far the largest.
It would, yeah.
Okay.
One thing that I just want to
Sure.
address, though, that I think is
Yep.
really important,
Yep.
that keeps getting conflated, and we
Yep.
want to make sure it's clear. So, out of state, because this is a revenue tax, out of state corporations pay this on the sales that are made here in this state. In-state corporations pay it. This is not about a competitive advantage. People are not going to leave. Comcast, I mean, the list of Home Depot, Walmart, Kroger, Wells Fargo, Comcast, all the big funders of the opposition right now are out of state.
And those companies
Corporations.
pay income tax in Oregon, and Oregon companies are affected, and at the end of the day, those companies are selling products and services to Oregonians, to individuals, to households, to small businesses, to Main Street restaurants, to local oncology centers. So the notion that this is somehow just this, ephemeral thing that only affects people outside of Oregon is just completely misleading. It
We're not
misses
saying
the
that it's
point.
only outside of. We're just simply saying on the one issue that you think you keep saying that corporations are going to leave.
They will. I have had multiple conversations with companies who will shut their doors. I don't know how many businesses you represent on a daily basis, but I represent thousands.
I've owned multiple businesses and run
Okay,
organizations here.
so let me just, another question about UBI, if you don't mind. So I understand the concept of UBI, but, and Antonio, you and I discussed this, but part of what's, I think, challenging for people to understand here is, certainly you understand that if you were to look at people who are living below the poverty line or living in poverty, that this payment would be helpful to them.
Mm-hmm.
The question is why everybody? Because there are a lot of people in this state who do not need $1,600. I mean, everybody would like to have $1,600, of course, but why make it in fact universal instead of trying to target people who actually are living in poverty and giving them more than $1,600? So walk us through that.
So there's a few main things to think about regarding means testing programs versus universal. So means testing meaning that there's an income threshold. Anybody below that would receive it. There's a few key pieces. We know right now with means tested programs that those who need it most, a large percentage of people who need it most are often left out of those. Right now, housing vouchers through HUD, only 1 out of every 4 families who need a housing voucher receive it. For SNAP, we're talking about food to people, to kids and families. Only 1 in 6 people who need that food assistance aren't able to receive it. Now, the reasons they're not able to receive it are numerous, but some of the more important ones are the level and amount of work that has to happen for individuals to prove where their income is. So there's a really great clip by Representative Porter online if people want to check it out, where she actually has a conversation with the administrators of SNAP, goes through some of the questions that are required and the amount of data that's required, and actually says that the requirements for a individual single mom to try to prove their worth and their kind of right to have the food stamps benefits is more onerous and more difficult than what she has to report as a member of Congress to prove that she's not.
But you guys wrote this measure.
Sure.
So you could have said, for instance, if your Oregon tax return shows that last year you made less than, pick a number, $40,000, you got a benefit. So you could have made the gate very easy to walk through. We're not talking about SNAP, we're not talking about HUD or Section 8 here. We're talking about something that you wrote. So
Sure.
Why didn't you write a measure that would actually help people living in poverty and not help people who were middle class and above?
Sure.
When you set that gate, if you think of the top 1% being folks who, in your eyes, do not need this money, when you set that gate, you exclude a lot more than 1% of the folks who actually need the money. So to be able to,
But now,
I'm not in the top 1%, and I don't need this.
Let's say you make it 40.
pretty sure you are.
Let's say you make it $40,000 or $50,000. That doesn't make sense to me. Half the people in this state don't need this check.
Actually, Nigel, the federal statistics show that 500,000 people live at or below the poverty line. If you multiply that by 1,600, which is actually not a guaranteed number, the number can fluctuate over the years. But let's take the 1,600 figure. That's $800 million in distribution. It's a $6.8 billion a year tax. So I think you're asking a great question. In part, that question is what happens to the other $6 billion? Where is it going? Higher prices, people who don't need it, administrative bureaucracy to determine eligibility. The DOR says they need The Department of Revenue says they need 199 people to determine eligibility and prevent fraud. So
Let me, Antonio, please, let me give you a chance to answer that question.
Right, so think of, compare this to, for example, universal public education.
Yep.
You could set up a program in your mind where you exclude the wealthy or the folks who merely make $250,000 from public school. Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? That would clearly be a bad thing, right? We do not, it is unhelpful to set a barrier to access the good things of society.
I'm sorry. Maybe I'm not asking the question. If the purpose of this program, this new tax, is to benefit people who are living in poverty, wouldn't you exclude people who are not living in poverty and say we'd like to maximize the benefit to people who are living in poverty? Because the purpose of this tax isn't to help Angela Williams, right? It's not to help Phil. Not so.
So there's a few things that I think are really important here. One, right now, for those who fit into that 44% of folks who can't cover their basic costs, a large percentage of those people are living above the poverty line. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that the poverty line is ridiculously low.
Not a line.
I mean, so let's expand that conversation a little bit to be truthful and honest about what's happening on the ground for Oregonians right now. So if we take that number of 44%, which is an independent study by United Ways, looking at how many people in this state can cover their basic costs, we're talking about rent, food, childcare, those things.
Student loans.
That's 2 million, more than 2 million people. So if we think about those 2 million people, what we find right now that's happening in our economy is that most people are having to work more than a full-time job. And they're having to patch together through our gig economy income to be able to make things work. This means that from year to year, their income might change significantly. One year that they really need that money, it might look like they're doing fine from last year's tax reports, and they're not going to get it. The reality of where we're at right now is that we need to be thinking about something that meets people when they need it, where they're needing it, and not playing into all of these existing systems that ultimately don't help us understand what's happening on the ground. From our perspective, that's pretty important.
Okay, let me ask the question a different way. Why would you give this benefit to people who make more than $100,000?
So one of the things that I think is really important as well is to talk about administrative costs of means testing programs. And I'm not really sure the legitimacy of the conversation about 199 people.
Oh, it's in a memo from the Department of Revenue.
Needing to be able to push out money.
But that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking why give it to people who make more than $100,000?
It makes it easier, faster, the money that it would take to do it administratively to make sure that the 10,000 people who are millionaires don't receive it would actually go to. I'm trying to answer your question, so I'd just like to be able to finish this idea. Right now, when you means test something, a good chunk of anywhere from 5 to 10% of the administrative cost goes to making sure, building the tools. Then another percentage goes to trying to soak up all the people that are left out because of that through one reason or another, which happens every time. All of those administrative costs, instead of going to means testing, finding all of that, you're actually not putting more of the money that it takes to be able to easily push money out to everybody is a smaller percentage than what goes to people who don't deserve it. So from a fiscal perspective, we're actually allowing more money to go out to people by having it not be means tested, and we're ensuring that everybody who needs it gets it.
And we know that universal programs like Social Security are more popular in the community and more resistant to attack from special interest groups. And another example to follow up on Stacy's point is the EITC. And our friends at the OCPP talk about this all the time, how something like 20% of folks who are eligible to claim the EITC, earned income tax credit, don't get it because of these barriers. So forget it, like the OCPP also published during the pandemic, it is better to just give everybody the money. Yeah. And if the legislature wants to, they can increase taxes, the top tax rate from 9.9% to 10% and claw back the $1,600 in a second.
Okay, so
So
makes
a couple
much
things.
more
The
sense.
Oregon Center for Public Policy, by the way, opposes this measure.
Right,
But
let's
they
talk-
still said, they didn't say this.
But they oppose this measure. The measure that is before voters that you wrote is what this decision is about. It's not about what you hope it does or what the legislature might do or what you wish the interpretations
But-
were. The measure is
But I'm not
opposed by,
talking about
all
that.
I'm saying is a fact. The
Yes,
Oregon Center for Public
I work
Policy.
closely with the Oregon
Great,
Center for
that's
Public Policy. And
they're
there's-
opposed.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
And their primary reason for being opposed, the number one that they list, is universal. And there are differences in opinions around guaranteed and universal.
There are
We
many
had-
reasons that people oppose this measure. I'm
I'm
just
talking
making
about
it
Oregon
clear.
Center for Public Policy.
Correct, and I'm just making it clear that a group
Yeah.
you kept invoking is actually, they might be supportive of some of the things you're talking about. I'm not going to speak
Yeah,
for them
that's
on
my
that.
point. Thank you.
Okay, but my point is, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Measure 118, which they oppose, along with hundreds of organizations.
We were talking about why 118 is universal, which is consistent with some of their ideas
Correct.
they published before.
But the point is it's a flaw that leads to some of the opposition here. It seems a little disingenuous to talk about, the speculative things or things we wish were happening.
Just-
You
Wait,
wrote
what?
the measure,
Excuse me?
you put the measure on the ballot. The vote is the text of 118.
We would love to talk about some of the other
Right,
areas
that's
of
what we're
concern
talking
and
about.
questions, or if there's something else on the universal side that you want to make sure you're
No,
understanding.
I think we've covered the universal side. I want to ask you both, yesterday, the New York Times had a reporter here to cover the Kroger trial, and the Times story was about a food desert in Rockwood, saying that there used to be 3 large grocery stores in Rockwood, which for people watching this online is a low-income neighborhood in East Multnomah County. And now there's one, and that one may disappear if this merger happens. So part of the concern that people who are skeptical of the measure have raised is that imposing a 3% tax on sales is onerous for low-margin businesses like grocery stores. So in a way, if this measure were to pass, you could be hurting the very people that you're hoping to help by discouraging low-margin businesses, grocery stores
Right.
being among the most common, from continuing to operate in certain neighborhoods. So
Can I just
can you
make
address
two-
that? Yeah.
So there's 2 things that I'd love to
Yeah.
bring up around this. So the strike that was here and that was happening with Fred
Yeah.
Meyer, Kroger owns
Yeah.
Fred Meyer.
Yeah.
So the net earnings for Kroger in 2022 is $2.3 billion, up from 1.7 in 2021. So during this massive pandemic where the conversation was about supply chain issues and we're not going to be able to make ends meet, and they raised prices, the inflationary numbers that we're talking about right now that are hurting Oregonians was something that Kroger did. They've been taken to task for price gouging right now. Inflation, price gouging, these things are happening without Oregonians getting any cut of it to be able to put back into the economy. The other piece that I really want to make sure we're hitting home on is that 44% of Oregonians who can't cover their basic needs right now, when they receive the $1,600 for one person or $6,400 for a family of 4, that money is going right back immediately into our economy. That $6 billion that corporations wouldn't be paying are going to take that money directly out of here. They're going to give it to their shareholders. They're going to give it to their CEOs.
Yeah.
So the idea that Kroger isn't going to open a Fred Meyer in a food desert because they don't think people are going to be able to afford it, there's billions of dollars of new dollars that are going into our local economies to be able to.
We're not just talking about
can
Kroger's.
let me just talk through this with you for a second.
Yeah.
So Albertsons reported their quarterly profits last week, and I looked at it just to see what their margin is. The margin in their most recent quarter was 1%.
Mhm.
So you're talking about adding a 3% tax on sales to a business that is netting right now after tax and all expenses 1%. So that's why stores close. Yes, Kroger made $3 billion nationally, but that's because Kroger has thousands and thousands of stores that operate on a very thin margin. So if you apply a tax on sales to a thin margin business, they either don't make a profit or they raise prices, one or the other. So and the idea that stores aren't closing is demonstrably false. That's why we have food deserts in this country because the grocery stores have pulled out of low-income neighborhoods because they're not making money.
Because people don't have money. This is an interesting like chicken or egg thing, but the reality is food deserts, like people in food deserts are relying on bodegas and corner markets because they have money to spend, not enough that makes it worth these larger corporations when they map everything out to say that's worth it. If you give millions of dollars to people in that neighborhood every single year, it will now be viable for those large corporations to start thinking about things. They're going to factor that into their mapping. Absolutely.
There's also, let's not forget that a lot of grocery stores who do operate on low margins are independent stores. Some of them are family owned, some of them have one store, some of them have 3 or 5 stores. They're still subject to this tax directly, and some of them that are not are going to be subject to the tax indirectly because the food products, the energy to run a store to keep the cold foods cold, the insurance they pay for their site, their workers, all of that's going to go up. That's all increased cost. So actually, Nigel, the 3% tax on sales is only one of the cost drivers that's going to go into affecting a low margin business like a family owned grocery store that's going to ultimately result in, as you said, closing, cutting jobs, or raising prices, or some combination.
It's important to point out that a small family-owned corner store or grocery store almost certainly does not sell $25 million worth of stuff. So they are not going to have to pay this tax, and this is super important, right? The people who are paying this higher minimum income tax are only predominantly ginormous corporations like Comcast and Fred Meyers.
So let's talk about that for a second. Can I just, so if you think of Comcast, if you think of Amazon, Comcast isn't leaving, right? Because people aren't going to stop watching cable TV. Amazon's not leaving because people are in fact going to be buying more if stores close. So I'm not persuaded that large multi-state corporations or multinational corporations are going to.
I'm concerned about the family-owned smaller businesses, the the privately owned medical clinic it's going to be too difficult for them to continue offering their services. So they'll shut down, which could result in less access to healthcare in certain neighborhoods. I'm talking about the family-owned grocery stores that have 2 or 3 locations. I'm talking about the Main Street restaurants that, yes, Antonio, we agree. I mean, the numbers are clear. They probably do not have 25 million in sales and don't pay the tax directly, but they take a restaurant. If they've got food, they've got beverages. Often those are bought from larger companies. They've got insurance for their business and their employees, often bought from a larger company. They've got internet to run the card swipe and banking, the credit card payment system. They've probably got cable to run the television in the bar. They've got costs and inputs that do come from these bigger companies. So the costs get passed down to consumers. Again, individuals, households, small businesses.
So we have a small example of a tax like this in Portland, the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which we sat in this room a few years ago and talked about, and the proponents said it'll raise $30 million a year. Now it raises 200. So they were very wrong, but they were right about one thing, and that's that people are paying that tax, and we're not really seeing that businesses left town because of that tax, because they're making money. They can pass that tax along to consumers. So you guys are.
I'd love to talk about the
higher prices.
I'd love to talk about the
higher prices, but and there's no question that they are passing that tax along and they're staying here. So are you? I mean,
well, Walmart left.
Okay,
but it's a question of whether they left because of PSEF or crime.
Right.
So, or a combination of both. That's the important thing to remember here is policies are cumulative.
We've talked about where UBI works. Tell us about a place where businesses really left because of taxes, because the impression that the PSEF example would give you is that businesses just pass the tax along and they keep doing business.
Yeah, and our biggest concern is the cost to consumers, which is the higher price effect. I mean, that is without question what's going to happen here, and that is the biggest concern, is the higher prices. But I want to go back to this notion. You've got the PSEF, You've got other policies. Businesses don't often make decisions about closing, which is, you've invested a ton as a business, both emotionally and financially. You don't make that decision necessarily because of one policy, but there are straws that eventually break the camel's back. There is no tax of this magnitude in the country. And so we don't know what the direct implications are going to be. That's part of the problem here, is that the consequences are so potentially damaging and unknown because there isn't anything like this anywhere in the United States. The magnitude, the order of magnitude here is extraordinary for a gross receipts tax. So you start to layer that on top of things, and eventually people make those hard decisions. But again, it's the prices. You talked about it. Businesses pass these prices, these costs through, and consumers end up paying more.
So from the inflation side, I'm really glad we're having this conversation because I think I agree, this is certainly what the opposition is hammering as hard as possible. The Legislative Review Office ran algorithms on this 3% plus 3% and what the cost to consumers will be. So independent, probably on our...
Actually, they didn't run it on the compounding, they ran it on the base model, but yeah.
So they identified that for a family of 5, the additional costs, the pass-on costs, would be around $1,800 a year for a family of 5. The same family of 5 would receive $8,000 with this rebate. So they would be a net positive $6,200. So I appreciate, even if corporations decide...
Minus federal taxes.
Even if corporations decide to pass this on, families and individuals will be a net positive. And I think I'd like to just go back to this core idea. We've had a war on poverty for more than 60 years, or approaching 60 years. We have literally not done anything or seen anything that has had lasting long-term effects cross-generationally to help address and lower poverty rates. When we have something in front of us that is an opportunity to be able to cut childhood poverty in half, similar to the child tax credit of 2021 that our federal government passed, for a family of 4 under the child tax credit would receive around $6,000. That lowered childhood poverty in our country during that year by half. Now, right now, a family of 4 in Oregon would get a very similar amount of money, around $6,400. And we're seeing similar numbers here in Oregon of cutting child poverty. I would love to understand from a Oregon business and industry side of things, any kind of piece of legislation, anything that they would be willing to commit their money, resources, time, energy to, that would have that kind of impact on people here in Oregon that need support. That's what's on the line right now. We have not seen anything. Democrats, Republicans, there's nothing that has come along that has had this kind of impact directly on poverty. And it seems absurd that right now, especially with the numbers around inflation and the amount that people are going to be getting, and that we know every family, including the small business owners that are running mom and pop shops, are going to do better under this, even with passed on inflation. I don't understand why we're having such a crazy conversation around that this is a fringe and horrible idea.
Well, we've talked about the fact that this would be by far the biggest experiment with UBI.
Sure.
Ever. And what we haven't talked about is that, the recent history of ballot measures funded from out of state that attempt to make large-scale changes is not a happy one. I'm talking specifically about Measure 110.
Sure.
So you have in Oregon a robust community of people like OCPP that have worked on how to alleviate poverty. You've got a number of legislators who are very interested in legislation that would alleviate poverty either through more low-income tax credits or other programs.
Sure.
But that's not who's at the table here. Who's at the table here are people from California who want to impose a policy on Oregonians. Why aren't the people who've been working for years and decades on poverty in Oregon in this room?
So I've been working on poverty, and I'm in this room in Oregon. I run a nonprofit here.
Same.
Antonio's been a labor organizer for a very long time in Oregon. Those folks are represented, to say just really clearly, so right now our campaign has received $220,000 from 3 individuals or foundations. Those individuals or foundations that are out of state believe in challenging our current ways of addressing poverty. The opposition has raised almost $10 million. The vast majority of that money has come from out-of-state corporations. When we're talking about out-of-state operators getting involved in in-state issues, I'd really like for us to be honest about what's happening right now, because this is not commiserate. This isn't a bunch of outsiders. These are people. I've lived in Oregon since 1993. I've owned businesses. I've gotten my degrees at Portland State University. I got my degree in education, was a teacher. I am having conversations with people across this state all the time, and they support this. The Oregon Democrats, when this came up for a vote of whether or not they were going to endorse, 51% of the people in that room, more than 400 delegates for the Democratic Party, voted to endorse this. They needed a 60%. It didn't pass. Leadership of the Democratic Party, like Tina Kotek, doesn't support it. But everyday Oregonians that are Democrats, they do.
Can I just respond? The coalition who opposes this, I mean, it's, first of all, 80% of the contributions that are reported are from Oregonians, so I don't know where they're getting their math, but it's all publicly disclosed.
I just pulled it from online.
I'm not lying, because it's all publicly available. It's to say that the vast majority of our money is not from Oregonians, that's also inaccurate. But the coalition that opposes this, businesses do oppose this. They understand the economic consequences of this. You know, the Eugene area, which I think is where, Antonio, you said this was written down in Eugene, the House Revenue Committee chair, the House Business and Labor Committee chair, the Speaker of the House, they're from Eugene. I don't know why, we're trying to do an end run around smart people who have been working on policy, as you say, for decades, and doing this on the ballot funded by out-of-state interests, when instead we could be sitting down and having robust conversations about this. Legislative leaders, political leaders, okay, they oppose it in vast numbers. They're with us on this. They don't like this. But labor, Tax Fairness Oregon called this a hot mess in the blog post about it. Left-leaning think tanks, right-leaning think tanks, taxpayer groups, pro-tax groups, public employee labor unions, private labor unions, businesses, churches, nonprofits, social welfare organizations, a massive number of people. I've worked in and around politics for over 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. The opposition to this, I think, just speaks to how deeply flawed this proposal is. And again, we're not talking about what legislation we might be able to pass someday. We're talking about the question you put before voters this November, and it is deeply flawed and widely opposed.
Yeah, can we just come back? Why Oregon? Like, why did the folks from California decide to bring this to Oregon?
So they didn't, first of all. So the origin story of this is 8 years ago, a group of 12, 6 years ago, a group of 12 individuals came together to talk about ways to improve Oregon. From there, they grew hundreds of people who collected signatures. At a point when it became apparent that those hundreds of people who were collecting signatures as volunteers weren't going to be able to make the ballot, they weren't going to be able to collect enough, a few funders came in to help close that gap. This did not originate in California.
So the California people saw a promise for this in Oregon.
They were like, this is interesting and this is exciting.
Are they trying to do the same thing in California? Are the California funders doing the same? Did they have a similar effort there?
Well, to be clear, we're talking about $220,000. You're not gonna,
They spent almost $8. They spent, I think, over 800,000 gathering signatures.
Are they working in their home state on this? I'm just curious.
Yeah, for
they
sure.
are.
Yeah.
What's the state of play there?
Right now in the state of California, they've passed legislation to fund statewide basic income pilots, and so right now there's more than 30 pilots that are running in California.
But is anyone proposing a measure like this in any other state?
I think that there's a recognition of the cost it takes to get a ballot measure.
Yeah, that's kind of what concerns. That's what I've heard from people is we feel a little like guinea pigs up here, right? Because it's cheaper to run ballot measures in Oregon than elsewhere. And,
Sure.
We're a more experimental group, but we're starting to feel I think people are starting to feel a little abused.
Well, and I have a question. Did
I'm
you
just
jump to
curious.
the ballot process, or because I applaud people coming together to try to think of creative solutions. That is civic engagement at its finest, and I love it. But did you jump straight to the ballot measure, or did you engage those legislative leaders? Did you engage those thought leaders on what an alternative might be before rushing to put something on the ballot that we now have to contend with as a deeply flawed measure? And
Yes,
and
so-
why are those folks, if you did, why are those folks opposed to what you ultimately put on the ballot?
So as the person who led this thing from the very beginning, right? I think that here what you're speaking about, Angela, is an issue of privilege. Privilege that you have, and privilege that myself and the other folks who started this work do not have. So in the early days, as a labor organizer, right, super concerned about income inequality and like the hollowing out of the middle class.
In my experience, labor organizers know how to find their local elected officials. I mean, the delegation in Oregon is exceedingly accessible.
I would love to hear. Let him finish what he was going to say.
And so we just started meeting community spaces in and around Eugene to kind of imagine a more just Oregon. That was it, right? And none of us were none of us were like famous people or people with recognizable names, right? Tons of lived experience. And we were all experts on the conditions and the economic pressures that we feel regardless of where we were economically. So for example, 3 of the 12 folks who drafted this ballot initiative were experiencing some degree of houselessness, right? One lived and still lives in a shed, one lived and still lives in her van, and one at the time was couch surfing. And so this is, bringing all this lived experience together is why we were able to come up with such a robust program that is so inclusive and protective of lower income folks, while at the same time making sure that the benefit was broadly felt enough so that everybody in the state could participate and we could all grow together. In early days, I mean, I should have saved these emails, but I didn't, right? When you're just super grassroots community folks and you send that email at info@bluechip.org or electedperson.org or elected person, you don't get a call back because we did not have like the privilege that you have representing the OBI and being like, we can mobilize $9 million in 3 weeks if we want to. And so I think it's really important for you to, if you can, make an effort to put yourself in our shoes, where this is the ballot initiative process is the tool that everyday Oregonians have to make the most meaningful impact in their society.
Yeah.
And we're just using that tool.
And like I said before, I applaud civic engagement at the grassroots level. I grew up in a house where my parents would host community meetings with people to talk about these things. So I love the notion of people getting together to think about real world problems affecting them, affecting everyday Oregonians. To me, and believe me, there are legislators who don't necessarily return my calls either. This is about, it's a pretty extraordinary leap, it feels like, to sit in a coffee shop and write a $7 billion a year tax bill without, checking with people in the legislature whom I respect deeply, who are very progressive leaders and Democratic leaders from that very community, from across the state, without checking to see, hey, is there a path here? And it just feels like a very big leap to then say, well, we couldn't quite mobilize, but we just leapt to an idea of a ballot measure.
Okay, do you mind?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's going to cost.
So yeah, the fact that it's a big leap is a testament to the hard work of the everyday Oregonians who managed to get this thing on the ballot, and the 170,000 people who immediately recognized when we put a clipboard in front of them that this was a good idea. So thank you. We'll take your kudos. We did have those conversations, but the fact of the matter is, and everybody knows this, when you go talk to a policy center like we did with OCPP 6 years ago, or several electeds, which I will not name here, several years ago, the first question is, it's going to cost you $2 million to do this. If you don't have $2 million, the conversation ends here. And so we kept on getting the doors shut on our face, and so we innovated, we got scrappy, and not necessarily against all odds, but against a huge bunch of odds, we managed to do this thing that is like really freaking awesome, right? Like, we're going to reduce child poverty by half in Oregon.
So
That's
let me-
fantastic.
If it were so
Can I-
awesome, I don't think hundreds of
I would
people would
love
be
to just address
opposed.
the guinea pig piece that was actually the start of this conversation, if I can, just for a moment.
Sure.
Oregon, when it comes to the actual end result of this, we are not a guinea pig. There's Alaska to look at that functions very similarly as far as how much money goes out. We have the child tax credit that went out in 2021. We have clear success metrics for infusing this much money into the pockets of individuals. There's no doubt that it's going to have the impact that we are talking about, that even the Legislative Revenue Office has said is going to happen. Right now, 67% of our general fund is paid by individual taxpayers. 14% is paid by corporations. Okay, we all just let that sit in our bones for a minute. Our annual budget for this state, 67% of the money is generated by taxpayers, individuals, 14% by corporations.
Yes.
When this is enacted,
So you're saying that
So we
what does that
know
mean?
we know that as a state, we need to generate new funds in order to be able to do what the federal government was able to do for the child tax credit. And so when we look at what's a way to generate funds to do that, corporations are one of the clear tax-paying brackets that are underpaying in their taxes.
Are they underpaying in Portland? Because I just saw a report that C Corps, are pay the high. Multnomah County, Portland, when you stack, all the jurisdictions up, has the highest corporate tax rate in America. Do we need to go higher? I mean,
I don't know. Do you feel like corporations should pay more than 14% of our general fund?
Well, that's not all they pay. That's the whole point. If you look at the stack on corporation, at all the different levels of taxation for corporations in this county, it's the highest in America.
Right.
Yeah,
And
businesses
importantly,
also employ 1.7 million people in Oregon. So the wages that they're paying those people generate the incomes that pay for critical tax services. Businesses also contribute extraordinary amounts of money through philanthropy to civic and community organizations at all levels. I want to talk about the budget though for a second. This is a tax measure that ends up creating a hole in the state's general fund to the tune of billions of dollars because of the way it's written. And the last thing I just want to make sure to say, because this notion that we somehow just poof generate money to infuse into the economy is false. Money doesn't, what are the cliches? Money doesn't grow on tree, there's no free lunch. Money doesn't just appear in people's pockets. It comes from the economy, and the economy is cyclical, and so people will pay higher prices. When you tax, this is not anything more complicated than high school economics. You tax sales, people pay more in higher prices.
Even when you don't tax sales, we pay higher prices.
That's right. So this is going to
Let's just
exacerbate.
acknowledge that
Well,
at least
this is
in
going to
this, we're
exacerbate
going to leave people
existing-
better.
This is going to
under this
exacerbate
model.
existing
We talked
inflation.
about-
are we back to inflation?
Yes.
Okay, I think so. The inflation rate is back down to 0.2% in the last CPI. PPI is about the same. We had a spike in inflation during the pandemic, and I think we could all argue about why that was, right?
I think there's enough reports out there that show
Right.
that greedflation was certainly a portion of that. There was a lot of
A portion, but I mean, I'm not sure we're ever going to know
I'm not exciting quarter.
all the different factors there.
Sure.
Right? We're getting back down to it. We're getting to a place where inflation is becoming tamer, and the Fed's likely to cut interest rates. Generally, I think besides that spike, I mean, we've seen incredible declines in things, in goods. Moore's law.
Sure.
Like, where am I going with this?
but we're not seeing a decrease in poverty rates. We're not seeing the ability
Right, so-
for individuals
okay,
to cover their needs.
So maybe forgive me for being naive here, but does this
Yeah.
do we need this because everything else we're doing about poverty is not working, because Social Security disability is not working, because rent assist isn't working? None of, and you're telling none of that stuff is making a dent, right? So should we abandon that and do this?
No.
Definitely not.
It's not doing enough. I think if we go back to some of the things that, this idea of like what a minimum wage would be today if it had kept up with inflation.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we work on minimum wage?
Let's do that
Yes.
too. Awesome. There's been the fight for 15 for years and years and years, and we still saw that getting watered down into these 3 different tiers in this state.
But
So I think let's do that. This isn't an either or. This is about how do we make sure, and I just want to be very clear, all of these conversations that have been had around increasing wages and all these things are really important. We are totally in solidarity. Andy Stern, the former president of SEIU National, is totally in support of this, has written an op-ed in support of why this is such an important thing for labor and workers. So this is not no labor supports it. There's a recognition.
Well,
that
SEIU, which the one you just mentioned, does not support Measure 118.
the former president of the national SEIU does.
But the people on the ground in Oregon do not. I mean, let's be clear, SEIU asks.
There's many members of SEIU that do. It's true that
But the organization endorsed a no.
Right,
Sure.
just
So
like
I also
Universal
wanna-
said no,
again,
and SEC members said yes.
But this is
Can I
actually
touch
an
on
either-
taxes, because that's super important, please?
But first, I think we need to be very clear. This is an either-or discussion. The thing before voters in November is Measure 118. It's the text of that measure,
Right.
which you all wrote and put on the ballot through signature gathering. It's not minimum wage. It's not any of these other things.
For
It's
sure.
not, we agree, the important conversation about the holistic discussion about poverty and other ways to improve it. It is one question, yes or no, on Measure 118. So we can talk in hypotheticals, we can talk about other programs that we wish were better or more impactful or should be improved, but none of that is relevant. Right now, the question before voters is this ballot measure, which is deeply flawed, which is costly, which is opposed
Costly to
by
corporations.
hundreds, which is costly to individuals, households, and businesses that will pay higher prices. And
A small
which
percentage
is
of what
why
they would be getting from it.
you are very good at interrupting. I appreciate that. Which is why hundreds of individuals and organizations are opposed to this. So
Okay.
the other discussions, I'm not devaluing them, but what we're talking about at this election is Measure 118 and a yes or no vote on that measure.
So you can jump in into this.
Thank you. You talked about taxes, and you also talked about how there are many taxes that corporations pay. It's important to keep in mind that for individual people, it's the same thing, right? I pay city taxes because I live in Portland. I also pay state, federal taxes. I pay gasoline taxes. I pay alcohol taxes. We all pay. We live in an ecosystem of taxes, and that's totally fine. That's the system we built. Cool. We're not messing with that. The fact of the matter is that what we are changing is the minimum corporate tax rate that after $25 million is less than 0.12%, while you and I pay in taxes in Oregon of 4.75 to 9.9%. People don't think that is fair at all.
The corporate income tax rate is 6.6% or 7.6%, just to be
And
clear.
none of these giant corporations pay that, because if they were to pay that, they would not care about Measure 118, because we only raised the minimum tax to 3%, and by law, you have to pay the higher of the two.
Except you're
So-
conflating a tax on sales
So
with
if
a
I may
tax on
finish,
income.
when you as an individual and I as an individual get this rebate, we can claim it on our taxes, and we can use it to basically pay our state taxes. And the LRO has talked about it, said that about 84% of Oregonians are going to use it as such, and that the typical tax return is going to be $2,100 lower, right? This is a huge thing, and a household making less than $40,000 is basically going to have their taxes paid for by this rebate. So it is true, by design, it's a tax increase on giant corporations that are currently paying almost no taxes in Oregon, and at the same time, it is a massive tax decrease for the people of Oregon. And so many of us feel that we are personally overtaxed. We're fixing that. We're helping fix that.
We're 5 minutes from the end, so if there's anything that you haven't said that you would like to say, please say it now. Otherwise, take a minute or two to summarize what closing thoughts. So we'll start with you, since we started with them last time. Anything you haven't said, or if you would just like to summarize what you have said.
Yeah, I'll just summarize. I mean, we encourage voters, this is complicated, costly stuff, and we encourage voters to take time to really learn about it. There's a lot on the ballot. They can go to noonmeasure118.com, but they can also read a lot of the independent news that's been written about this to understand how deeply flawed the proposal is. They can see the coalition list of hundreds of, again, labor organizations, businesses, small and large, nonprofits, elected officials, etc., who oppose this deeply flawed measure. And I think at the end of the day, voters are going to understand and they feel the effect that when you tax sales, again, this isn't about an income tax or profit tax, when you tax the sale of goods and services, consumers pay more. And they know that there's free money isn't free. And so I just encourage everyone to learn more about this. I look forward to continuing the dialogue over the next several weeks as ballots begin to drop in mid-October and election day comes to. And I, again, just want to thank the Willamette Week for your thoughtfulness on this, and the time you put into these and so many other interviews during this season.
Great, thank you. If you guys would like to.
Do you want to do the closing or?
I wanted to do this. Before passing over to you to do the closing, I just want to, I feel a bit remiss if I didn't mention this, because Angela has referred to this multiple times. So I want to say that to my ears, right, it takes a lot of courage to invoke inflation and raising prices by the people that the OBI and Angela represent, who are themselves the ones who are gouging us at the register, right? So Fred Meyer admitted in court that they had been raising the prices of milk and eggs far above inflation just to make more money. And it just, to me, it's mind-boggling and borderline, if not explicitly bullying behavior for the representative of these giant corporations to say to invoke continuing their behavior to try to get people to vote no. That makes absolutely no sense to me, and I just wanted to just say that.
Again, that gets back to the inflation idea. Where was the inflation coming from, right? I mean, you're postulating that it came from price gouging almost exclusively, or? Because inflation's been, except for the spike, it's been really tame, and the prices for a lot of things have come down a lot because of competition. But you're saying that this is really an issue. This price gouging is driving up prices.
Absolutely.
And that's the big driver.
That's the bigger driver.
And this thing is what, a drop in the bucket compared to that?
So can I just? I know we're trying to get to the closing. So, but go ahead.
I'm not sure what you mean by it.
Well, the 3% on sales. I mean, that's going to be inflationary.
Yes, and based on, if that's the case, let's follow that premise.
But,
we've already talked about this. If that is the case, we already have looked at many of the numbers that have been proposed and passed, and the algorithms of passing on those costs, and what the amount of cost to an average family would be, and it is a small percentage of the total that is getting.
All right, we covered that. We covered that. Okay, but I just want to square the circle in my head.
But before you finish your statement, I want to point your eyes to the top of page 20, to the top of page 17 in the LRO report, that 1.3% is inflation in 2030. So that's after 6 years of this program being in effect. So it's not 1.3% every year. it's by 2030. So the math that Stacy expressed is what is the way the LRO wrote the report is a little bit misleading because it leads you to believe that it's 1.3% each year, but then like when you go to page 17, it reads, and I'm going to quote here, prices are expected to be higher 1.3% in 2030 under IP17.
And they'll actually tell you if you talk to them that could go into effect in the first year. It says that it could go into effect immediately.
So this
Okay,
is a
so if
typo?
it does, that's still the numbers that I've been
Okay,
sharing.
Okay.
all right.
All right,
So,
good, sorry.
Stacy,
Go on.
Use it or
we
don't.
got
Yeah,
more
sorry.
people behind
For
us.
sure.
Please,
So
please finish up.
I just want to reground this in the intent and also the ethos and goal of this legislation, which I don't know how many people here have ever had to choose between diapers and milk for their kids. I have. I've had that experience. My sister has had that experience. I was raised by a single mom. We lived in tents in our friends' backyards. There are millions of people in this state right now who are having to make those decisions. And there is no legislation that has been presented in the last, since I've lived here, which is 40 years, almost 35 years, I have not seen a piece of legislation that would have this kind of immediate, deep, meaningful impact on millions of Oregonians. And it's happening like in my mind, like if the corporations are so like rah-rah about this, come up with a different solution. Right now, this is the solution that Oregonians have said that they want to see on the ballot, and we're going to have an opportunity to hear from Oregonians on November 5th. And so I'd really like to have us all leave that. Everybody here, by appearances, is probably now living in some kind of privilege. We're talking about the people, and it's millions in this state who are not. And we really want to make sure that that is at the front and center of what we're trying to do. Inflations, tax rates, OPC, like OCPP, whatever. This is about getting significant money, meaningful money into the pockets of Oregonians. $6,400 for a family of 4 is enough to help a family move, to get out of a bad house. It's enough for somebody to be able to decide that they're going to try for a better job with that is more stable, to get a used car so they have reliable transportation. This is a real and immediate impact on Oregonians. And for corporations who have been making record profits across the board during the pandemic, when the rest of us have been suffering, to have those folks right now be doing all of these scare tactics and pushing millions of dollars into an opposition story is deeply problematic and is challenging and coming up against the needs and wants of Oregonians. So I just want to make sure that that is very clear, that that's at the heart of this, is the people who need.
Just again, not to belabor this, but Intel and Nike have not been making record profits. They're two really Oregon-embedded companies that are really on the ropes right now. I mean, or they're talking about splitting up Intel and selling off fabs and selling off design. I mean, they're not making record profits. Nike's not making record profits. I mean, who's making record profits with those two? I mean, there's a lot of people really concerned about those two pillars of our economy. I'm not sure this is going to have an impact on any of that, but let's just clarify that.
Right, and Anthony, and part of that is that, remember that Oregon is like maybe about 1% of the US economy. And then these corporations, Nike and Intel, are global corporations. To tax the revenue from Oregon for Nike or Intel a bit more relative to all the money they make, not just in California or New York, but also Europe and China and everywhere else, South and Central America.
This is a drop in the bucket of their problems.
A bug in the windshield.
Right?
Like,
But just the record profit thing needs to be qualified.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're a little loose,
I'm not sure about
with
that.
some of the comments, but.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very
Awesome.
much. That
Thank
was
you.
really
Really
useful.
appreciate it.
Really useful.
Yeah, that was fascinating.